Hi, it's John Firth, and here we are with the 8th installment of Firth and Friends, coming to you from Brooklyn and from British Columbia, where I have, is that correct, Manijeh?
That's right, Vancouver.
Yes, Manijeh Colabella, a new friend of mine who is an expert in boards, all things boards of directors, advisory boards. And she's here to give us some of the inside wisdom of how you make sure your board, as a CEO, that your board is delivering the kind of value you want. And as a board, that you understand what is expected of you and how you can provide the highest value. And just as an aside, I just recently was made aware of the fact that Estee Lauder's board had gone through a major shakeup. I didn't know if you knew that, but interesting example. I don't think it's recent, but somebody was telling me about it, that there was a struggle between the family and the board, and they took it to the shareholders, and lo and behold, the family is no longer on the board. They may still have a seat, but their say has been reduced. So these boards are dynamic. They can quickly change. It's easy to come to disagreement, but it's also easy to get incredible value out of them. So I welcome all of our visitors, both who are watching it live and who are going to be looking at this after the recording after we've done this. Please feel free to make any comments or to ask questions. There should be a comment icon somewhere on your dashboard, depending on where you're watching the live stream from. In any case, welcome, Manijeh, and why don't you give us a quick overview of yourself, and then let's launch into the topic.
Absolutely. It's great to be here with everybody. And thank you so much, John, for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk about a topic very near and dear to my heart. I am with a firm based in Canada called Watson Board Advisors. We've got offices in Toronto and Vancouver, but we service organizations across all sectors, across Canada and beyond, into North America as well. Our whole goal is to focus on the organizations and how effective they are in terms of shaping the future of their organizations. So our focus is at the board level and the leadership level. We work with a lot of founders as well, and really helping make them stronger, because that really is the essence and the backbone of our stronger economy and stronger world.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get involved with this sort of work?
I came to it, I'm a lawyer by background, and started as a tax lawyer, but moved on very quickly when I was in-house for a number of years working with a publicly traded company. At the time, it was during the financial crisis when things really, of 2008, when things really came to light, and governance became more focused on, there was already a lot of focus on financial controls, internal controls, those kinds of governance aspects. But the governance landscape was shifting towards starting to become more around the board effectiveness and all of that. And I was reporting to a board. I sat on subsidiary boards and became more involved in that world. And that was really what led me to really doing this full time with Watson 7 years ago, with really thinking about shaping the conversation with a lot of different organizations. So really fascinating work, and a lot has changed in that time.
Yeah, and I've done the same. I've had a board. I sat on boards. I've presented to boards, lots of boards. What would you say was maybe the best experience you had, and maybe a not so good experience with a board, either being part of it, presenting, or having a board?
Yeah, the best experience is when it's a bit more of a collaborative process where both the board and the CEO and management team are really coming together. They really understand what each of their roles and the value that they bring, and they're working together. There's different roles to play. And of course, the board's role is one of stewardship and oversight, and the CEO is there for operating the day-to-day and leading the organization. But when they're coming together from a moment of, we're not here to get you, but we're here to help collaborate, I think that has been really effective. And you see that really coming alive in the boardroom. And both parties are coming together and thinking about, how do we make this whole organization a lot stronger? Where I've seen it really be challenging is where you've got a bunch of people around the table. And your title really reflects this, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But when people are around the table and they've got a number of different interests, and they're trying to really make sure that those interests are brought forward. They're coming at it with a particular mindset. They're not viewing it from the holistic aspect as well. It can really create dynamic issues. And then when people aren't really fully understanding their roles and what the boards is there to help do, it can be really, really challenging.
Yeah, I would say maybe the way I would say it is there are often competing agendas on a board.
Yeah.
And although it is there to provide the governance and stewardship for the organization, sometimes hidden agendas, even unconscious agendas, can get in the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, my experience, I'll give one of the not so great experiences, is when something goes hiccup. In my case, there was a firing that didn't work out so well that unfortunately I did. And the board immediately became aware of it. I made them aware of it. And I didn't at that time really quite understand why we suddenly I understood why we disconnected, but it sounded to me like they were more interested in beating me up than providing stewardship for the organization. We had to do some training and so forth. And I ultimately, after a year, just found that it hadn't, in my mind, hadn't really repaired itself. I don't think the board thought there was much of an issue, but I did, and I didn't feel good about it. So it's very easy to run afoul on multiple levels. And as a CEO, you have to be aware of, there are some things that the board does. There are certain stewardship aspects of stewardship that you may or may not like or even understand. So that's where the good relationship, the ongoing working relationship is important. So let's talk from the point of view of a CEO or head of an organization. And there's usually, you just talk to my group, the North Star Group, which is a group of business owners. And one of the things we said is you have to sort of start walking before you can run. So let's start there. And I remind everybody that I'm John Firth, and I'm here with Manijeh Colabella talking about boards of directors, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So where do we start?
Okay, well, I guess the first question is, do you need a board? For many founders, that's the question, right? They're often, they're growing, they're in the day-to-day, they, working a lot in the business and trying to just get things going. And they may even have advisors. They may have legal advisors, accountants, other advisors that are helping them along the way. But the question is, when do you actually need a board? And I think with a founder, really thinking about that, there's usually a few different points where you start thinking about the value of a board and whether you want to bring that in. Usually there might be some sort of growth that you might be trying to get into a new market, or you're undertaking a new initiative. Maybe it's a digital transformation. I mean, that's just one example, but something that's you're trying to scale and trying to get to that. And it's might be difficult to do with your current situation, and you need a group of advisors around the table. And ideally it's a mix of people that can bring different perspectives, people that might have been there before and can help advise. Succession planning is another one. If you were trying to bring in, you talked about Estee Lauder. At one point in time, they probably started off as a family business and started bringing in other generations. That's, might be one area where they're starting to think about having a board and thinking about the different voices of the family, but also other voices that aren't necessarily in the business as well. But succession can be family, it can be employees that you're looking at, or you're just bringing on a new partner into the business. So always good, because some of the things change, and you want to just have a group of advisors that are helping you think about what are some of those things you need to manage. Maybe it's a compensation strategy, maybe it's your own strategy for the business, outlining some of the risks and thinking through some of those corners as well. It can be really useful. And then sometimes you might be bringing in investors or new financing of some sort. In that case, you may be required to have a board, or they may, maybe part of your terms of the agreement that they want to have a board seat as well. So then that becomes a little bit more you start thinking about, well, what kind of board do I need? And in that case, you might actually need a full board that has full fiduciary responsibility for the business.
Uh-huh.
But a lot of times, if you have the ability to start before walking before you're running, think about having an advisory board, which really is a way of testing out the value of a board to help you along the way. Without some of those legal responsibilities, the people around the table don't have legal responsibilities to the organization, but they're there to really help guide you and help move you to the next stage of your business.
Yeah. And this is really true, I think, of both nonprofits and for-profit businesses, at least at the advisory board level. It really doesn't matter. However, there is one big difference. How do you compensate an advisory board generally?
Let me just back up a little bit. In the not-for-profit world, you're usually required, it depends on the governing legislation, but usually there will be some minimum requirement
Right.
for having a board, a number of people on the board. The question
Right.
there, you're absolutely right. And thinking about where the organization is going and what you're trying to achieve, you're still thinking about, do I have the right people around the table? Do I have the right number, the right structures? And it will depend on the evolution of that not-for-profit. So just
Right.
wanted to clarify that piece.
Yeah, you reminded
Yeah.
me. Yeah, you sort of skip over the advisory board.
Yeah,
And
you tend
your
not to.
board, generally in a nonprofit, they pay to be on the board for the most part.
Yes.
And they're usually involved with a nonprofit because there's some passion or some need that they're fulfilling, usually internal need to give back. And they're very quick to help and to advise if it's a good board. Now, there are quite a number of nonprofit boards that they pay their money and then really don't engage. That's a whole other issue. But you
Right.
sort of bypass. When I ran the Association for Management Consulting Firms, I just immediately had a board of, we started out with 13, I think, and expanded to 17.
Yeah.
So there was an advisory board. I had 17 senior partner consultants advising me. So it was kind of a luxury. But let's come back then to compensating when not a startup probably, but a young company decides to put together an advisory board. What would the compensation look like?
Yeah, it's going to vary depending on the stage of evolution. I think the main message is that you want to compensate your advisors.
Mm-hmm.
You want to, they're spending their time, they're bringing in their expertise. They need to be engaged and helpful. So you want to make sure you compensate them. The question of what that compensation is will really depend on your business and who you're trying to attract and why you're trying to attract them. The industry, you are competing in some ways and trying to, these people are giving of their time. What I will say, it's difficult to give an actual range because it depends on the organization. But so I would do some of that homework to see what makes sense. What I will say is that when people are coming to the board, they're not coming necessarily just to look for compensation. It's different than an employee position or a consulting position, right? Where you are paid regularly for your time.
Right.
Usually they're expecting to be giving of some of their time and advice and all of that. And it's just trying to find the reasonable balance to recognize that they're there to do that. In a public companies, of course, will often compensate through equity and maybe some form of cash retainer. In a private company, that may be a little more tricky, but that's something to consider as well. Certainly seen that, as a way of kind of compensating and just making sure the person is aligned as well with the growth of the business and all of that. Again, you don't want it to be over too much equity because that can compromise independence, but just enough to compensate them for their time and expertise. Yeah,
I've been offered positions on advisory boards, and it's usually somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5% of the equity to be on an advisory board. That seemed to be standard. There was a period there where a lot of people were talking to me about it. I ended up not doing it for a variety of reasons, but that's what I experienced. So your business is growing, and usually, the first thing that comes to mind when you decide to do a board of directors is it's not made by you. It's usually made by the investors who then require certain board seats. So let's talk about now when you move on to the larger board. By the way, we are talking about boards of directors here, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm sitting here with Manijeh Colabella.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm here with Watson Board Advisors and really enjoying this conversation around boards and governance and all things around that.
Yeah. So let's talk about moving on to a board of directors. As you said, there's a lot more responsibility. There's legal and fiduciary responsibility. And in case of the example I highlighted from Estee Lauder, you have shareholders. And when you have shareholders, at least as a public company, but even not as a public company, if you're still private and you have, let's say, 7 or 8 investors, those are the shareholders. And they may not all have board seats. But the fact is that suddenly it goes even beyond you or even the board. The board, by exercising its fiduciary and legal responsibility, is representing the owners of the company. And again, you as the CEO probably have maybe a majority stake or at least a significant portion of the equity.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. The challenge comes when you're talking about bringing in other investors, and so often in a private company, when you're scaling and you're bringing in those other investors, your board, as you said, sometimes gets created. By accident is probably not the right word, right terminology. It isn't by accident, but each investor, depending on their investment profile and the way they, what their philosophy is, some investors will require a board seat as part of their investment, and that's how they really guard and really just keep an eye on the business. And others will have a different investment philosophy, be longer term, and really have a different way of looking at that. So they may not require it. The challenge, and this is one of those ugly situations that I've come across, is where you've had, for example, let's say 3 or 4 or 5 different investors, each of which have different investment philosophies. One might be a pension plan. Maybe it's a very, very long term, thinking about those long-term sustainable returns. One might be, maybe it's venture capital or private equity, and they're looking to exit in a much shorter period of time. So they're looking for a quicker gain and in the lift in the business. So their time horizon is a lot different and their objectives are a lot different. But when you bring together investors that have different objectives and, at the end of the day, their role as a board, in Canada, it's very much ingrained in our law that the role of the board is to act in the best interest of the corporation, not in the shareholders. I think it's a little bit different in the States, although I think that ultimately the goal is still the same, to think about
the goal is still the same. And my guess is, I wasn't privy to what went on at Estee Lauder, and I just had a conversation yesterday, is that the board probably something happened with the shareholder price maybe, or the direction of the company, and there was a disagreement on the board level, and that quickly went acrimonious. And then the non-family board members probably fanned out across the major shareholders and built a case about, the family was behind the times. They didn't understand that Estee Lauder is no longer a family business, something along those lines. And then took it to the shareholders for a vote, would have been my guess.
Yeah, probably very likely. So I think, when you're bringing a number of different parties together on the board, alignment is so critical. So alignment around the purpose, what is this organization here to do? The values, particularly in family circumstances, what is really important to the family? What are the rights the family is retaining? And what will they need to maintain in order to move forward? And what do the investors need to also keep in mind? Building that alignment, and then building alignment around the strategic direction, that everything that you're going to go, because that will really shape the conversation. When people aren't aligned and they do have those different objectives, it can be really, really tricky. It can make for some really tricky dynamics in the boardroom and conversations. And then you see it, and you're not seeing people around the table that are there to really think about, can the organization move from this to this, and can we achieve those objectives and still meet our purpose and values that we're trying to unfold as well. So building that alignment is important. Sometimes it's also really important. I can think of an example when I think about a number of different investors coming together. where it can be really helpful is where those investors do come together, have that conversation and go, maybe we might not be, our nominee. We always have the ability to appoint a nominee, but we're thinking about the holistic, what's right for the organization, while also recognizing we have certain objectives. Maybe the nominee needs to be somebody a little bit different that can bring those conversations together as well. So thinking about it from a competency-based approach, who do you need? What are the skills, experiences, the conversations that you need to be having?
Yeah, and generally it's outside of, you sort of have your investor pool. Then you might have one or two industry experts, senior, recognizable industry experts, and then you might have probably a lawyer, some others, professional services type of folks, maybe a finance guy, to sort of make sure you have sort of all bases covered. So let's talk a little bit about bylaws, and then also the committee aspect and how you structure a board in terms of committees and so forth.
Yeah, bylaws. What would you like to know about bylaws?
It's pretty boilerplate. The bylaws I have determines term limits, expectations. It sort of defines the legal requirements of a board and the governance. Is that true? On each the other two.
Again, it'll depend on what statute you're organized under, but absolutely, the bylaws, most companies have some sort of set of bylaws, which really give a bit of a framework for, who your members are, the shareholders, what your board structure looks like. In my experience, some organizations, and you often see this with not-for-profits, they'll be very detailed bylaws about how we are going to govern. The challenge with that, it can give some certainty. The challenge is they become difficult if you need to make some governance changes, right? Because you need to get approval of your members, in the case of a not-for-profit, to change those bylaws. And if you've got a lot of members, that's a lot to bring forward. What I think is very useful is to have a set of bylaws that kind of just give the outline, the framework, the must-haves that you have to have, but really put more into governance policy, like have a manual or terms of reference or something that really outlines some of those structural elements. And then the board has the ability to change and design that as the organization, the company is evolving and what makes sense for the company. So you talked about term limits. I've got a few different views on that. Some will try to put in specific term limits, terms, your term. In many organizations, it's just a 1-year term and it gets renewed at each AGM. And that's more typical in a corporate context. But a not-for-profit might have longer terms.
Yeah, we had 1-year term limits, but we had one of those typical problems a nonprofit has, which is often it's hard to get the engagement that you would probably get in a for-profit. So the chairman who hired me, just nobody else wanted to be chairman. And she was actually retiring from IBM. She was a senior executive and wanted to use this as a transition. So when she said, I'd like to stay for another year, it was like, yay, we got a chairman of the board. It was then when she finally left after 2 years. Then it became a little bit of a problem. Also for me, was the chairman who came after her weren't engaged the way she was, and they didn't need to be in some ways because she and I had taken an almost bankrupt organization, turned it around. So the work was a little less intense. But there's nothing better than a really engaged chairman that you're aligned with, which is what I had the first few years.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think whether you're in a not-for-profit context or any other context, I think the other value you asked about committees, having a committee or a couple of people on the board that are really focused on the governance, the succession planning, and thinking ahead to, okay, well, who do we need around the table? Somebody's term might be coming up. Will they be able to continue? Do we have the ability for them to continue? What other perspectives do we need? Really continuing to plan forward and think ahead to what the organization is going to need. Again, that's going to be very much tied to the purpose, values, and strategy of the organization, where they're trying to go to. But the thinking ahead. Where it becomes troubling is when you're not really planning, right? You're kind of just, oh no, somebody just jumped off the board, or we lost a whole bunch of people,
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah.
now we're starting fresh, and we haven't really thought that through. The value of a governance committee, or a group of individuals, or
Or a
advisors that can
nominating
help
committee.
that.
In that case, the nominating
Nominating,
committee. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah,
That
it
is
can be really
refreshing.
valuable.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I've seen, again, nonprofit boards are a little bit different than for-profit in the fact that, people are paying to be on the board. And often the mindset is, I gave you $10,000 or $50,000.
Right.
I'll show up when I can show up. And then you've got that inertia that will set in. And often the begging to anybody, please, anybody be the chairman or the
It can
president.
be.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the um, the importance of the leadership aspect of what they do. For me, the experience is very much that the chairman and the CEO have to be aligned.
Yeah.
Most things, they don't have to necessarily be in agreement, but they have to be aligned. In other words, sort of have the same vision, same understanding of the mission and the values of the organization. And there'll always be disagreements. But as long as you're really strategically aligned. But, the chairman plays a very, very important role.
Yeah.
They really are truly the leader. So talk a little bit about sort of best practices for chairmen of the board.
Yeah, what I would say, the chairs, they're not the boss of the board, right? So they are leading in a different way than the CEO might lead the organization.
Yeah, exactly.
They are absolutely the facilitator of the board, a facilitating good conversation. And good conversation doesn't mean everybody needs to agree. Ideally, you're getting different perspectives out there. You're looking around those corners. Somebody recently said dark corners. And I thought I really like that. One of my colleagues, I really love his quote around the chair of the board is the steward of the relationship between the chair and the CEO, not the boss of the CEO.
Yeah.
I really like that because it really does show that. And they're also the steward. Well, all of the directors are stewards of the organization, but the chair is the facilitator, bringing that together. So that alignment that you talk about is really important. Having a strong relationship with the CEO. And that doesn't mean friendships, it's not that kind of, it's again, that everybody is recognizing that both play very different roles, but having a regular cadence of checking in. Usually I see weekly or bi-weekly, check-ins between the CEO and the chair, thinking ahead. The chair is helping design those agendas that are coming up. What topics do we need to talk about at the next meeting? Helping to plan a forward calendar for the year. Like, what are those things? Because you can't talk about everything at every single meeting.
No,
and you really need to design it. Yeah.
You have the cadence of strategic planning too. So our cadence was pretty clear. It was same old. And then came June when when I was tasked with putting together a project to evaluate certain things. Often, in our case, it was direction. What's the next thing we're going to offer? It was very much let's see what else we can offer our members to recruit additional members into our association. And I would usually hire usually people did a pro bono, to come in for 2 months or so, interview the board, look out in the marketplace, do sort of regular strategy consulting work, so that by September we would have our strategy meeting, and then subsequent meetings after that we're putting the budget together and so forth. So I would say half the time we were looking at, and we're going to talk for a second about ideal, best practices in board meetings, but we were reviewing progress against the strategy and the budget and the operating plan. And then the other half, I would say, was actually developing it in one form or the other. Actually, no, I would say about 2/3 following and about a third of the time spent developing the strategy for the next year.
Yeah, and in today's environment, where there's so much uncertainty on the forefront all around, one of the it's again important to kind of have that. Love that you checked in on a very regular basis around progress and where you're going, and you also talked about half of the developing. But having the discipline as a board and CEO and leadership team to really think about, does this still make sense for us? What scenarios have we missed? What have we not contemplated? What do we need to think? So it's strategy, but it's also looking at it from a lens of enterprise risk as well, thinking about it holistically. And and that frankly, boards are needing to govern and having some different level conversations because of the many uncertain things that are going out there and how quickly it's changing. So being able to respond fairly quickly and being agile to do that is really important as well. And again, the chair can play a big role in aligning with the CEO around that as well.
And the rest of the board. And in the case of shareholders, again, it's a little bit of a representative model. The shareholders are represented by the board. So the board may talk to shareholders pointillistically, but coming back to I thought of the chairman of the board a little bit like a ringmaster, here to the ground, talking to the board members, so that I would get fed things from Peggy, my chairman of the board, that clearly had come out of conversations with her fellow board members of either concern or just to highlight what's going well, maybe not going so well. But let's talk about, from the CEO's perspective, preparing for board meetings and what you take into a board meeting. In my case, since the first 2 years were really a turnaround, unfortunately, we did that fairly quickly because we were both aligned behind that. It was very much financial information. They really wanted financial information just to make sure that the whole, the bottom didn't fall out, which it didn't. And plus a little bit of subsidiary information. And so a cash flow statement was very important. And I would deliver this at the end of beginning of the month after the preceding month. So they had an ongoing, so they would get 12 of those. And then there was a bigger package for the actual board meeting with more qualitative stuff. But what are some of the best practices you've seen in the CEO preparing, or what does the board usually want to see, and how do they want to see it?
Yeah, where I've seen it work really well, when the CEO understands that, somebody said this to me once, you get what you feed the board, right? And it's not about controlling the message. It shouldn't be controlling the message. It should be being transparent and no surprises, right? Fundamentally. But
no surprises,
how you design that, the CEO and their team has a really important role in designing that to help the board do its role well, understanding that fundamentally the board is not involved in the day-to-day, so they don't have the same information, so they need to, and nor should they have the same necessarily the level of detail that the CEO might have. It needs to be at a higher strategic level for them to operate at the right level and ask their questions. But going in with the mindset and knowing that the board's job is to question, is to challenge assumptions, is to kind of help you see around the corners and test things out, start with that basic premise. So when you're putting a good briefing note together or a summary, start with the end in mind, right? Think about, what do you need to do to bring the board along? So if it's something new you're kind of testing, test it out first. Don't come up to them with the board and say, okay, tomorrow we're going to do this big financing and we need your approval. I've actually been in that situation. And I've seen it happen with a number of our clients as well, where the board is being asked to make a big decision and they really haven't been brought along the way. And sometimes they go, no, we're not approving it. And it can be pretty, catastrophic, right? So but they can't exercise their duty because they haven't been brought along. So the CEO really needs to understand the role of the board there and how they can help them accomplish that. And then it becomes around, okay, how do I do this in practice? So if you're going to give them a whole bunch of operational detail and reports, and you haven't really told the story, and you haven't invited in, okay, board, this is where I need you to weigh in. This is what would be helpful for me to understand. Here are some of the things we're thinking about. Here's the scenarios we've looked at. You're going to get them diving into the operational details because they're not really sure, right? They're like, okay, well, what do I do with this, right? Or it's going to feel like you're being challenged in a way that you don't feel is right.
And they may not even be meaning. It could just be that
absolutely
you just dropped a bombshell. You didn't tell us, this is the first I've heard of this. And it's maybe not minor detail, but some detail that the board really doesn't have to concern itself about it, either because we
Right.
have a team internally that's fixing something, or it's I don't you did a law degree, I did an MBA, and on your is it the MCAT? I can't remember, whatever the test is that we took to
Yes.
there was a whole section about
GMAT.
reading
Yeah.
out what the important information is from the not important information.
Yeah.
As part of this. So it is really understanding there are just some details that you do not want to open the Pandora's box. And I don't mean that in any evil sort of way. It's
No, but
just
you're
that you have a limited time with your board, and the last thing you want to do is suddenly get bogged down in some operating or some issue that you inadvertently raise that suddenly deep six, a lot of the conversation. And it's ultimately not useful. In fact, it can be detrimental because you end up often confusing the board members.
Exactly.
You want.
Yeah. You want to keep the board at a strategic level, thinking about it in terms of where you're going, what the longer term direction is, as well as the risks to get there, and making sure ultimately the board also just needs to make sure and feel comfortable that this is a healthy organization, but from both a financial, operational, culture perspective, right? Those are the things. And so keeping that in mind is really important. Now, not every board member, even if you've gone through the task of bringing your board along, your meeting materials are the best they are, and you've got good conversation. It's only as good as the board members around the table who actually take the time to read and prepare.
Right.
I mean, every board member is legally obligated to do that, especially if you're on a fiduciary board, but not everybody does. So again, the importance of reflecting at times on both the relationship, the CEO chair relationship, the board CEO relationship, and then just how individuals and the board as a whole is performing, taking that time to reflect and evaluate, because it may mean that you some of your board members may not be performing the way they should be. And that's a conversation as well. Again, the chair, an important role for the chair to have. Yeah,
exactly. And it's usually the chair that notices that problem early on. I mean, the CEO might recognize it too, but as I said, the CEO is not the one who's going to ultimately roll out the process of asking a board member to leave or correcting an issue. So I see we're almost up to time. I want to thank you, Manijeh. Manijeh is an expert in all things board related, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In parting, is there any words of wisdom you'd want to give to someone either about to join a board? How do you make the decision about joining a board? And anything that we haven't discussed about the CEO's role with the board?
If you're looking to have a board, think about what you're hoping to achieve from the board, what the value is, where are you at in your stage of business. If you have the ability to walk before running, do so, test it out, and don't just look at your own network to find the people around the table. Invest in that and getting the right people, and invest in some education for yourself, for the board, around just aligning on good governance and thinking about that. If you're thinking about joining a board, you may be new to the board role. Again, if you've been experienced as a CEO or other leader, business leader, it is a different role than the operational role. So think about the experiences that you've been through. Think about how you position that in terms of a more strategic, being able to look at it from a multiple different perspectives and lenses, and position yourself that way as you're seeking out board roles. And look at board roles that really speak to you. Don't just sign up for anything, the first one that comes along, because that can also be detrimental. Really think about and do your homework around it.
Yeah, and again, know yourself well enough to know what the value is you would add as a board member. That often is a good guiding light to decide if this board or the other one is a better fit. But great. Well, thank you. For those who are still with us, you notice we have our email addresses next to our names. Feel free to contact either Manijeh or myself if you have any further questions. And I hope to speak to any one of you who are interested in the work that I'm doing. And hopefully Manijeh has inspired you also to talk to her if you need some advice on boards. So thank you, and I will see you next week.
Thank you so much, John, for having this conversation. It's great.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you too.